from sea to shining sea throughout the solar system and extending to interstellar regions beyond. This is the Kevin Smith Show. Talk radio like nowhere else on earth.
Comments and views expressed on The Kevin Smith Show are those of the people that make them and do not necessarily reflect the views of Kevin Smith, The Kevin Smith Show, or its affiliates or sponsors.
Hi, folks, and welcome to the Kevin Smith Show, whoever you are, wherever you happen to be, all around this gorgeous place we call Earth. Thanks for being here at the Kevin Smith Show. I know you could be doing a million other things tonight, but you chose to be here, and I appreciate that. I sincerely appreciate that. I'm here because you have a right to know, and because you matter. I want to remind everybody that we have coming up, actually this Saturday, it's coming up this Saturday, the Alternative Universe I-Conference. A whole new concept in conferences. Instead of you having to buy expensive tickets and then have to buy plane tickets, train tickets, bus tickets, or gasoline to get to the conference, and then you have to pay for a hotel room and extra meals while you're out of town. Instead of all of that, the conference is coming to you. This actually will be our second one. We did one March the 3rd. This is our second one. And it happens this Saturday. It costs you a whopping $10 for a ticket. But ticket sales close Friday. We have to do that. Logistically, we just have to do that. So you need to get your ticket right now if you haven't already done so. 5 great presentations by 5 great speakers, and let me tell you something, they're not pre-recorded. It's live, coming straight to you. It's being produced for you. Okay? And a question and answer period at the end of each presentation, just like you would at any other conference, but this one comes right into your home. How about that? All right, $10, that's it. And in order to get your ticket, just go over to my website, kevinsmithshow.com, and click. There's a gigantic link that says Alternative Universe I-Conference. Click it. If you can't see that link, you won't be able to watch the conference. All right, it's huge, a huge link. Just click that, and you'll be able to register and get your ticket for the I-Conference, okay? Tonight is free to watch night. We do that a couple of times each month so that you, if you're not a member, can get a little bit of a taste of what you're missing. But listen, our members community is not entirely, and it's not even, watching is not even the major thing in the members community. But here's a little taste of something that is in the members community. You get to watch for free tonight. Just get over to my website, click where it says watch, and then watch. That's it. That's pretty easy, isn't it? Okay, now, if you're not a member, then of course you can't watch every night. And as you will see, it is a radio show. However, if you're watching, you do get to see pictures that the guest refers to on many, many occasions. Most of the time, the guest has some photographs that go with what he or she is talking about. And you will get to see those if you're watching. And it really makes things a little bit spicier, a lot more fun. So if you're not a member, fix that. Nobody but you can fix it. Just click where it says join up there at the top of the page. We're going to step away for a break, and when we come back, we are going deep sea diving. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back to the Kevin Smith Show. 100 years ago yesterday, the world's largest and most luxurious ocean liner struck an iceberg and sank to the bottom of the ocean. 1,517 people died that night. It was and still is one of the greatest disasters in the history of our planet. The ship was the Titanic, or was it? In recent years, researchers and investigators have come across information and evidence that actually seems to tell a different story. Some have written books about it. Some have made documentary films about it. Well, tonight, which is just one night after the 100-year anniversary of this great, awful disaster, we ask a lawyer to review the evidence and to review the case that evidence seems to make. The great ship cannot be raised, ladies and gentlemen, but perhaps the truth can be. Gordon Gianninoto is formerly a very successful attorney. He practiced in New York City before retiring to a life of a bit more freedom. And he is the guest that I have asked to give us the real story of the Titanic based on the evidence that has been turned up by all of those who have investigated this very dark mystery. Gordon, welcome back to the show. Delighted to have you back. Are you with us, Gordon? Well, our guest is apparently not with us. The panel shows he's there. Yeah, Gordon. Okay. Welcome back to the show. We're glad to have you. We can't hear you, Gordon.
I am.
No, we cannot hear you. Your audio is all messed up.
Good, yeah.
Okay.
The right.
Okay, tell you what, let's do. Gordon, you give me a call at 623-444-5889, and we'll do this on the telephone until you can get that fixed. We talked on, we have him on Skype, and we talked on Skype just a few minutes ago, and we'll see. This is him calling back. Let's see, Gordon, can you hear me?
I hear you perfectly. Do you hear me?
We can hear you now. Gordon, welcome back to the show. What's the deal? Look, let me tell the audience this. It was several weeks ago that Gordon told me in a telephone call about this Titanic thing.
Hear me now?
Yes, we hear you, Gordon.
Well, I'm here.
And so he told me about this deal with the Titanic, and he began to tell me that it was not the Titanic that's at the bottom of the ocean. And as much as I respect Gordon, when I first heard that, my mind sort of did what your mind may be doing, and that is, oh, yeah, right. But then he began to lay out the evidence. And so I asked him to come here tonight. We would have done this on the anniversary of the Titanic, but that happened on Sunday. And we don't broadcast live on Sunday. So as close to the Titanic anniversary as we could get was tonight, one night later. And so I've asked Gordon to lay out this case and make the case to you in the court of public opinion about this. Gordon, you say that the Titanic is not what is at the bottom of the ocean. Educate us. Well, Gordon, we're still having problems with your audio. We're not getting anything from you. So tell you what, please do call me on that telephone number. I will send it to you on Skype, and if you will, call me on that telephone number, because we're not getting any audio at all out of your Skype. Okay? So hopefully Gordon will be able to get with us here. Technology is a funny thing. As I say, just a few minutes before the show, I talked with him, and everything was fine. There was no problem. And then here we are, showtime, and his audio is messing up, so we cannot talk to him. Can't get his audio. The story goes like this, folks. And we'll if Gordon is able to get in touch with us, then we'll have Gordon on the show, and we'll get him to lay the case out. But it goes like this. The Titanic, of course, was billed as the newest, the biggest, the most luxurious ocean liner ever built. And so it set sail, and it set sail from Southampton and headed across to New York. And on April the 15th, in 1912, the story is it struck an iceberg and it went down. And 1,517 people, 1,517 people died. So let's see if we have Gordon on the telephone. Can you hear us now, Gordon? Okay, now welcome to the show, and lay out the case for us.
Thank you. So, I like to be quite thorough, and when I hear something or whatever, I do research. I don't like to just accept what other people say, and I like to see if there's something that I can use to back it up. So I was pursuing the research, and I saw this YouTube video listed that said Titanic, the ship that never sank. So I thought, wow, that's very interesting. Then I watched the video, and I saw that it referred to a book that was written by this man, Robin Gardner, and I thought, wow, and it absolutely convinced me. I mean, it makes sense to me. So I started to look into it even more, and I realized that, of course, that's the only explanation for what went on that fateful night 100 years ago in one day.
Okay, give us the story in a nutshell. If it's not the Titanic, what is it?
Okay, it's the sister ship, Olympic, that was built the year before, and it was extremely defective, and there was no way that they were going to get insurance coverage for it, and so they switched the nameplates at the time that they were both in the dock together at the shipyard, which was Harland and Wolff in Belfast, Ireland.
All right, now you say it was extremely defective. Why was it extremely defective?
Well, that's a great story by itself. White Star Line was in desperate straits in the early 1900s, and they decided to finance the entire line of ships by giving a mortgage to J.P. Morgan. And J.P. Morgan, therefore, if anything went wrong with White Star, he could just come in and take every single ship that the White Star Line owned and bring it back to New York. But he wasn't interested in doing that. He was interested in making money. So he was meeting with J. Bruce Ishmay, the head of White Star Lines, I guess the president, in 1908, and they decided that Cunard was taking far too much of their business, and they needed to come up with a new line of ships, and they decided to build 3 gigantic ships, each 888 feet long, and the first one would be the Olympic, the second one would be the Titanic, and the third one would be the Gigantic, which was later renamed the Britannic. So the Olympic the keel was laid in December 1908. It was launched in October 20th, 1910. And every time that White Star created a new line of ships, they always painted the first ship in the line gray so they could take high-resolution photographs. So the Olympic was painted a beautiful gray, and then once the photographs were taken, the hull was painted black. So Captain Smith, the famous Captain Smith who went down with the Titanic, was the captain, and they were just leaving the port of Southampton on a nice day, September 20th, 1911. Okay,
now, when you say he was the captain, you mean he was the captain of the Olympic?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And he went from that to being captain of the Titanic.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so he's captain. He's actually, he's been much vilified as being an awful captain, but in fact, there's really nothing you can point to that was his fault except for getting involved in the sinking of the Titanic. And but in any case, it was a nice day, September 20th, 1911. The Olympic is built. It's in operation. It's leaving Southampton. And along from behind comes the British warship, the HMS Hawk, which was a destroyer. And it had a very sharp bow, and it had below the waterline where you couldn't see it, it had a gigantic projecting, it was sort of like shaped like a torpedo. Many ships. I went to see the Queen Mary, the second one that came to Maine, and I noticed that it had that kind of a design, and it really cuts the water in such a way that it reduces the drag on the hull of the ship.
Okay.
But in the case of the British Navy, that was designed to actually just penetrate below the waterline and severely damage any ship. So if nothing else worked, they could always ram their opponent.
Okay.
So approaching at a 45-degree angle from the port side aft, in other words, from behind the Olympic, the British warship just cruised right into the stern of the Olympic. Just penetrated, just speared it, basically. And it made a huge triangular hole that was wider above the water and went down to a narrow line at the waterline. But below the waterline, it went down like a keyhole and then opened up into a big round hole. Now, the watertight decks, remember the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic were all built with the same watertight compartment design initially, and later supposedly the Titanic and the Britannic were the watertight compartments were expanded. But in any case, the Olympic is now speared on the port side near the stern by this British warship. So it limped back to Southampton, and they did some emergency repairs, and then they brought it up to the shipyard in Belfast, and they went through some bigger repairs. But the thing was the British Navy held a court of inquiry to decide whose fault it was. And Lloyd's of London had insurance on the ship. So the British Navy found that, of course, it wasn't the destroyer's fault, that instead it was the suction from the stern of the Olympic that sucked the British warship into the Olympic, and therefore it was not the British Navy's fault. So Lloyd's of London refused to pay the damages on the ship. They didn't pay one penny. So
let me say this now for our listeners. If you want to do a little research on this, the name of the British ship, that the warship that rammed the Olympic is the Hawk, H-A-W-K-E. Okay, right, so it'll be the
HMS Hawk.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is that this impact, you see, this impact bent the keel. There's just no simple way around it. Now, I was paid to be a photographer on the maiden voyage of the QE2. I crossed the ocean a couple of times on the New Amsterdam, the Atlantic Ocean, and I've been on other cruise ships, and I'm very interested in ships. I live near the ocean. I've worked on commercial fishing ships. I know the structure of ships. I know what they're like. And this all interests me tremendously. So when you bend the keel of a brand new ocean liner, there is no fixing it. But more than that, you have to understand that these ships were powered by 3 propellers. The central propeller had a very long drive shaft, a propeller shaft, that went all the way forward to the forward engine. Then on either side there were bigger propellers with bigger engines, but they were more aft. And the impact when it bent the keel also bent the propeller shaft. So they put some timbers in Southampton, and they brought it back to Belfast, and they realized they weren't going to get any insurance money, and the impact had popped the rivets on almost all the plates down the side, the port side of the Olympic. And you've got to realize in those days things weren't high technology. This was perhaps the largest mobile object ever created by mankind, and so it was all new. The plates that it were made of were 30 feet long and 10 feet wide and 2 inches thick, and the rivets were heated in a coal fire and then tossed up to a riveter, who then forced it through the holes, lining up the plates, and men on the inside hammered the edge over on the plate. So it did not take a lot of work. I mean, it took a lot of work, but it didn't get great results, because as the rivet cooled, it couldn't be hammered over. So this was the height of technology in 1908, but the thing is when you get an impact like it took from the British destroyer, what happened is it popped all these plates. But more than that, it crushed the frame inside the ship that the plates were resting on. So when they got back up to Belfast, they realized they couldn't just pull off these plates and put them back on. They had to add structural steel on the port side to hold those plates, because the natural curve of the ship was caved in. And they had to disengage the central propeller shaft from the keel because the keel was twisted, and they had to mount a brand new shaft, which they took from the Titanic and put in the ship. So they fix it. They don't get any insurance money. They send it out again.
Okay, now let's say right here that the Titanic at that point is under construction.
Exactly. Yeah. And the fact that they took the central propeller shaft from the Titanic just delayed the Titanic that much more.
Okay.
So Captain Smith is in New York. He's heading back to Southampton on the Olympic. Now, the thing that you've got to remember is that the Olympic, because of the bent keel, had a decided list to the left. So the ship would never sail horizontally. It was always leaning to the left, and it wanted to steer to the left as well. So this is major damage. And
all right, we have to step away for a break, and we'll return right after this.
No, this doesn't look like it either. Hi, we were walking around when suddenly we got trapped in this time portal. We've been going in and out of time, trying to find our own time. It's been interesting, especially seeing the pyramids in construction. Boy, those Egyptologists got it wrong. But we're getting a bit anxious about getting back to our own time and finding out what's happening on the Kevin Smith Show. What is it? What's the matter? What are you looking at? Hurry!
The government does know. I can't back that up, but I think that at Wright-Patterson Field, if you could get into certain places, you'd find out what the Air Force and the government knows about UFOs. Reportedly, a spaceship landed, and it was all hushed up, quieted, and nobody have never heard about much of it. I called Curtis LeMay and I said, General, I know we have a room at Wright-Patterson where you put all this secret stuff. Could I go in there? I've never heard him get mad, but he got madder than hell at me, cussed me out, said, don't ever ask me that question again.
sound. These are strange days we found. We found. So give me sound. Strange days we found.
This is Gary calling from Nebraska. You are listening to The Kevin Smith Show.
Welcome back to the Kevin Smith Show. We are talking with Gordon Gianni Noto, and he is, among other things, an attorney, a lawyer. And so we're getting a lawyer's eye view of this evidence that the Titanic at the bottom of the ocean is not, in fact, the Titanic, but its sister ship, the Olympic. And so we went away for break, and you were saying that Captain Smith was on board the Olympic and headed back to England. There was a little bit of a gap in information there because last time we heard about the Olympic, you were telling us it was being repaired in Belfast, and then you next thing you were saying it was on its way back from New York to England.
Yeah, this is a later. The collision where the British warship speared the Olympic and bent the keel was in September 1911.
Okay.
In February 1912, after they had repaired it, they were on a regularly scheduled trip to New York. They were leaving New York to go back to Southampton, and they were passing over the Grand Banks. Well, you have to remember that in February 1912, they did not have sonar, they did not have radar, they did not have GPS, and a previous ship had sunk on the Grand Banks. And this previous ship, which I never did find the name of it, but it was laying on top of the Grand Banks, and it was just big enough that it was almost reached the surface where it couldn't be seen. And Captain Smith, doing nothing wrong, following the exact route he was supposed to take from New York to Southampton, actually rolled over this giant ship that was on the bottom in the Grand Banks. And in doing that, he damaged the right-hand side of the ship. In particular, he actually pulled the propeller off, and the actual Olympic's propeller should be on the bottom somewhere in Grand Banks.
Okay.
So, with only the other two propellers, the small one that ran down the center of the keel and the larger one that was on the port or left side, they limped back to England, and they brought it back to the shipyard, Harland and Wolff, in Belfast, Ireland, where the Titanic was in dock. And the Titanic was about to be launched. And they realized that the Olympic was basically a bunch of scrap metal, actually, worth just maybe 100,000 pounds or less. And there was no way that this ship was going to last or be useful, and they had no way to collect insurance on it. And somebody, probably Bruce Ishmay, but nobody knows for sure, got the brilliant idea, why don't we switch the nameplates on the two ships? Which is a great idea because the Board of Trade, which does inspections of ships, knew that the Olympic was highly damaged. So by putting the name Olympic on the brand new Titanic, when the Board of Trade took it for its sea trials, it would pass everything. And the Titanic being brand new and the White Star Line being fully trusted, they wouldn't take the Olympic, which was actually the brand new, renamed the Titanic, They wouldn't take it on any sea trials because everybody knew it would be perfect.
Okay, so what we have here then is a fake Titanic.
That's right.
Okay.
We have a fake Titanic. Now, you've got to understand that there are some differences between the ships. One ship has 14 portholes on the forward deck, on the bow. There's 14 little circles. Those are portholes. That's actually the sea deck. Has 14, and the other ship has 16. The Olympic had 16, and the Titanic had 14.
Yeah. Now, what the audience who are watching are getting to see is photographs of these two ships. The Titanic, and those who are watching, I'll give you time to count those little portholes there. It was built with 14 forward portholes. Okay, so if you've counted them, and you should have by now, there are 14 of those. Now, what we are going to see is the Olympic, and this is when the Olympic is in dock either for repairs or under construction. And we can see there are 16. Now, one thing I want to, I'll see if I can kind of verbally describe this for those who are listening. Think of, starting near the front of the ship, a porthole, a space, a porthole, a space, a porthole, a space. But as we get towards the back of this, you have a porthole, a space, a porthole, 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 space, porthole, porthole, space. Okay, so we have some doubles back there. And this is very important in the evidence, folks, because with the Titanic, you don't have that. With the Titanic, you simply have a porthole, a space, a porthole, a space, a porthole, a space, all the way back. And there's 14 of them. There are no doubles. On the Olympic, there are some doubles. And you should be able to see those.
The thing to remember is that now that I'm mentioning this, I'm hopeful that somebody's going to go back down to that ship and count the portholes. And that isn't all they should be looking at, but we'll get to that eventually.
Okay.
So you can see that Captain Smith had nothing to do with getting speared by a British warship and the British Naval Board of Inquiry letting him off, blaming him for what obviously the warship did.
Yeah.
Now, the logic, and I mean, I'm a logical person, and I'm an attorney, and if I heard this in the court of inquiry, I would just laugh. I mean, I don't know how they could say this with a straight face, but they said the backwash from the Olympic was so powerful it sucked the British warship into the Olympic, and that's how the Olympic got speared.
Well, I would think at that point the military, the British Navy, would, if that's what really happened, they should have some extreme concerns about the power of what they're calling a warship.
Well, you know, at the later inquiry on the Titanic sinking, they picked the one officer to hold the hearing who they knew would keep his mouth shut and steer all the evidence the way the British government wanted it steered. And the way the British government wanted it steered was that this was a brand new ship that sank, and it should get an insurance claim. Now, the original amount of the insurance was...
Okay, well, now you've jumped to talking about the Titanic, right?
Well, I'm talking about the insurance on the Titanic.
Yeah, well, let's stay with the Olympic and its crash with and its inquiry for just a moment. So we have the Olympic as the Olympic going through this board of inquiry, this investigation into the crash it had with the HMS Hawk, and the board of inquiry is saying, okay, it was the fault of the Olympic. And so now we have a severely damaged Olympic that's not going to get any insurance money. It has to be repaired without insurance. They get it somewhat... I'm sorry?
It has a bent keel.
Has a bent keel.
Moon. It sails to the left and it leans to the left.
So they have the Olympic somewhat repaired so that it does make a crossing, gets over to New York. It's leaving New York, headed back to Southampton, runs over a sunken ship and damages the right side. It limps back into I guess to Belfast, well, Southampton, and then to Belfast. It gets to Belfast, and now they have to do something about this. It's just junk now. And by the way, folks, it is absolutely extreme in its luxury, just like the Titanic.
Well, the interesting thing was that the Olympic, having been launched the year before, had linoleum floors, and it was always, the bookings were always full, and the linoleum got worn. So they wanted to switch the nameplate. They also covered all the linoleum with brand new carpeting so that nobody would tell that that was the Olympic.
Okay. All right. So now let's talk about that nameplate for just a minute. Well, the original nameplate, and I'm going to put this picture of the Olympic back up, and the reason I'm putting this back up, it's very, very hard to read. If you're watching, it's very, very hard to read. However, you can see the name of the ship sort of engraved up there on the side of the ship. How did they do that?
Well, what they did was they took thick steel plates, and they, using like you would with a piece of wood and a router, they, with a bevel bit in it, they engraved into the steel at a bevel sides the name of the ships. So that was welded or riveted onto the body of the ship.
Okay.
And that was firmly affixed, and because it was beveled and because of the sunlight, it was very hard to see the lettering. There were no shadows. There were very, very, very hard to see shadows to make out what the name of the ship was.
All right.
But when they decided to change the names, they decided to take raised lettering and weld it to flat steel plates and rivet the plates onto the old names. So they riveted the name Titanic onto the Olympic, and they riveted the name Titanic onto the Olympic, vice versa. So they
took Olympic and put it on Titanic, and they took Titanic and put it on the Olympic.
Exactly. They didn't remove anything from either ship. They just added plates that were riveted at the corners or the original name.
Well, they replaced the sign. They either replaced the signs on the lifeboats or they switched out the lifeboats, because the lifeboats did have Titanic on them.
Yes, and they just repainted them. There were so few lifeboats. You see, you have to understand, this happened during the weekend before the Titanic was to go to Southampton to load up for a maiden voyage.
Yeah, and there's also the thing about the dishes. I found that very, very interesting. You would think that on board the Titanic you would have all of the china, the expensive dishes would say Titanic on it, but they don't.
But they didn't, no.
What do they say?
White Star issued the same silver service, the same silverware, the same dishes, plates, cups, and bowls, and serving dishes to all of its liners. So they all had exactly the same service.
Okay.
So there was no individual markings that needed to be changed there. But the problem was Harland and Wolff closed for the weekend. So the workers only worked Monday through Friday. It was a very tough job. They're glad to have the weekend off. They were very poorly paid. There was kind of a depression going on around that time, or a recession.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone went home. So it wouldn't take much to pay a certain small number of people very well to rivet the new names onto the ships and repaint the lifeboats and a few life jackets. Most life jackets were blank, didn't have a name of the ship on them. So
also,
it was actually a small job.
This guy Ishmael had made the decision to reduce the number of lifeboats from 48 down to 16. So there weren't that many lifeboats. All right, we have to step away for a break. We'll be back right after this. All right, welcome back to the Kevin Smith Show, and my guest this evening, Gordon Gianni Noto. We're taking a lawyer's look at this whole Titanic thing. Okay, so we've got the nameplates switched out, and the way they switched them out, the first ones are actually an integral part of the side of the ship, the original nameplates. And so the ones that when they switched names, what they did is created a nameplate and riveted it onto the side of the ship, right?
Exactly. So it sat above the surface, and the lettering on those plates was raised because they had taken other plates and cut them out, cut the letters out, and put the letters on top of, so they were like an inch higher or an inch and a half higher than the surface.
Okay.
But that wasn't all, you see. The problem is you can send the shipyard workers home for the weekend, but when they come back on Monday, they knew, for instance, I don't know which side it was, but let's just say, they knew the Titanic was on the right and the Olympic on the left. They come back on Monday, and it's the Olympic on the right and the Titanic on the left. So they weren't fooled. Mm-hmm. The reason why I say that is there was a coal strike going on, and you don't keep these ships which burn something just immense, like hundreds of tons of coal an hour. You don't, or thousands of pounds of coal. I don't really know the rate, but it was substantial. You don't just keep them at full speed and take them out in the harbor and switch positions in the dock. It would make no sense to anyone, and it would have cost a fortune. So when they came in, it must have taken a little while to get around, but anyway, it got around, and everybody knew something funny had happened. So
you also now when they get ready to sail, you've got a crew that walks off the boat, right?
Well, that's what I'm about to say is, see, they had already hired the entire crew, and the entire crew was leaving from the shipyard at Harland and Wolff. So they all are on the ship. They sail out of the Harland and Wolff shipyard to go to Southampton to take on all the passengers and the cargo and the equipment. And when they got to Southampton, every single person on the ship walked off and refused to set foot on the ship ever again.
And what was their reason for that? What was their excuse?
They didn't give a reason, and if they did say to anybody what the reason was, I'm sure the White Star Line went out of their way to cover it up. But as I told you privately, I don't know about you, but nobody wants to set foot. If you're about to go on a ship and the whole crew says they refuse to set foot on it, maybe you want to be one of the ones who doesn't go on it yourself.
Well, yeah. Yeah, if you're on an airplane and the captain of the airplane says, whoa, there's something wrong here, we're not flying this. Well, the normal procedure, of course, is the plane is grounded, they put you on another plane, and they fix that one. But what if, instead, they simply put a new crew on? Would you stay on the airplane? I don't think so.
See, there are a lot of superstitions with ships. Like sometimes I've heard things like people won't go on a ship if a rabbit was brought on board in a cage, or if a woman set foot on a ship, or there's a whole list of things that are superstitions of the sea. But for whatever reason, it never became public, not even for a minute, why the crew, right to the last man, refused to set foot on it again. That was it.
But now that did not include the officers, did it?
Well, that's the interesting thing is, evidently, when Captain Smith was offered to take the maiden voyage of the Titanic, quote-unquote Titanic, he said he would only do it if he selected the top 8 officers himself. So those officers did not walk off and refuse to go on board, but everyone else except for the top 8 officers was replaced. And that includes the wait staff, too. The wait staff, the cleaners, the maitre d's, the whole thing.
Yeah.
All of them.
All right, so
there's other things that are very interesting. You see, the Titanic, it was a maiden voyage, and J. Bruce Ishmay and his wife were booked to go on it. And 3 days before it sailed, Ishmay's wife made other plans.
Okay, so J. Bruce Ishmay is the CEO.
Yeah, CEO of White Star.
Okay. Now, on the screen, people are seeing 3 pictures. They're seeing J. Bruce Ishmay, or Ismay, or however it's pronounced, Captain Edward J. Smith, and then Thomas Andrews Jr. I've called it the Titanic Trinity. This is the president or CEO of White Star Lines, the captain of the ship, and one of the principal architects of this ship, Thomas Andrews. They're all on board. Captain Smith did not survive, and Thomas Andrews did not survive. Only J. Bruce Ismay did, because he was in one of the first lifeboats and left the ship.
And he never survived the ridicule and the scorn that he received from that day forward.
Yeah, from that day forward, he stayed out of the public view.
He was leader of White Star for about another year, and then he was almost never heard of again. But he could not. Wherever he went, everyone was under orders to never mention the Titanic.
Okay, so the Olympic.
This isn't all. You've got to understand, this is the single most luxurious ship of that day.
All right.
So, of course, the rich and the famous wanted to sail on it, which meant that they would ask for first-class accommodations.
All right.
Well, it was very strange, and I'm just going to mention this as an analogy. You can do what you want, but remember how empty the World Trade Center 2 buildings were on the day they blew up?
Yeah.
Well, the White Star Line told everyone they did not have any first-class cabins anywhere on the ship, and that the highest class that somebody could purchase would be second class.
Okay, and why?
Well, they were trying to discourage people from being on the ship because they had a plan, and the plan didn't involve the ship being fully laden with only 16 lifeboats.
Okay.
So 3 days before, J.P. Morgan is finally told, and he had arranged for all these incredible bronze sculptures to be made for him in Europe and shipped to the Titanic so he could take them to his estate in New York in the United States.
Okay.
3 days before the ship sailed, he had those sculptures removed from the ship. And J.P. Morgan and 50 of his friends canceled their bookings.
3 days before.
Yes.
Ismay's wife changes her plans 3 days before.
Exactly. Okay, now you've got to understand, and I'm not trying to, the reason why I'm even discussing this, Kevin, is because, as you know, I have been able to contact extraterrestrials. I've learned about pole shift and Planet X, and I find that, NASA is lying. They're still looking for extraterrestrials. They're still looking for Planet X. And this whole story interests me only by virtue of the fact that your parents and your grandparents have been told since day one, since their birth, that the Titanic sank. And this is a huge, gigantic lie. And all I'm doing is asking the listeners to say, if this is a lie, what else is a lie? And there's so many lies, there's almost no end to them.
Well, let's look at some of the evidence. We've already shown some of it. We know that the Titanic had 14 of these forward portholes, and we know that the Olympic had 16.
Exactly.
But when I look at this, there are several pictures of the Titanic as it's leaving Southampton on its maiden voyage, its only voyage. And what we see is the Titanic has 16 forward portholes here. Okay, it's labeled the Titanic. They've changed the nameplates. So we know that the actual Titanic has 14 forward portholes, and the actual Olympic has 16. But when we look at what is labeled the Titanic as it's leaving port on its maiden voyage, it's got 16. All right, we're going to step away for a break. We will be back right after this. Welcome back to the Kevin Smith Show, and for those of you joining us just now in this second hour, welcome aboard. We're delighted you are here. Now, you do have my sincere sympathy for whatever it is that kept you away from that first hour, because you have missed tons and tons and tons, several light years of information, and you'll just have to catch it in the archives or watch the latest show after we finish with this. But anyway, we're talking about this mystery of the sinking of the Titanic. Today is one day after the 100-year anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic. And 100 years, and this has still been one of the most mysterious and awesome events in history. And it fascinates people. People were absolutely fascinated, just enthralled when those subs first found it and went down and photographed it and took video, and you got to see it on television. People were just absolutely blown away by it. And we're going actually to take a look at a still shot from one of those submarine dives in just a moment. But what we're doing here, we have Gordon Gianninoto, who is an attorney, and a lot of other things as well. But Gordon Gianninoto is taking a look at this from the perspective of a lawyer looking at the evidence. And one of the things that we've sort of keyed on here has been that the Titanic, the actual real Titanic, had 14 forward portholes, and its sister ship, which was older and by this point very much damaged, it has 16 forward portholes. And then when the Titanic sets sail on that fateful voyage, it has the ship has the name Titanic on it. They look the same, except for a few very minor cosmetic differences. But one of those cosmetic differences is that this Titanic has 16 forward portholes. Now, what I'm going to do is put a comparison up so you can see. The real Titanic had 14, the real Olympic had 16, and the fake Titanic, it's actually the Olympic, relabeled, leaving port on its maiden voyage as the Titanic, has 16. Gordon,
that picture is famous for another reason, but it directly related to what you're saying.
Okay.
The picture of the Titanic leaving with 16 portholes was later incorrectly identified as a mistaken picture, that it was really the Olympic leaving.
Really?
Because somebody entered the portholes and said, well, that can't be the Titanic, that must be the Olympic.
Uh-huh.
And you see, throughout time, White Star has done nothing to clarify this at all, because they used to release posters that you could buy that were put up in travel agencies, and they had a picture of one ship in the picture. It was a painting, and then below it said Titanic Star Olympic. So they did nothing to bring out any of these differences.
Okay.
But there's more circumstantial facts. Now, you've got to understand that I had an FBI agent and a Maine State Police detective come to me once and said, we're asking you if you would get your law license in Maine, because we would like to have you become a prosecutor in Washington County. And I said, well, in my opinion, I love all of Maine, but when you go to Washington County, which is east of me, it's like you've fallen off the edge of the earth, and I just couldn't imagine living there. But I do have a prosecutorial mind, and I am telling you that we can get a conviction on circumstantial evidence.
Sure.
People think, well, if you don't have the body, then you can't prove there was a murder. But yes, yes, you can. There's forensic evidence, and there's plenty of forensic evidence, and all that we need to have is somebody to go down there and make a list and find all of these particular items. And
we're going to talk about and I'm going to show, and we will talk about the nameplate, the picture of the nameplate on the ship that's down there. But we'll do that in a minute. Let's go on board the ship. The ship is on its maiden voyage. We're out there now.
Well, no, there's one more thing I have to mention.
Okay.
Now, if the Titanic has never been on its maiden voyage, it's never left shipyard, how come coal bunker 10 needed to be refilled? The interesting thing about coal bunker number 10 on the quote-unquote Titanic, which was really the Olympic, is that there was a fire going in the coal bunker. So if the ship has never actually been to sea, what in the hell is it doing with a fire in its coal bunker?
So now, what you're saying when you say there's a fire in the coal bunker, you're saying the bunker is a storage area. You're saying this coal in the storage area is on fire.
Yeah, it was smoldering. There was coal smoke coming out of coal bunker number 10.
Okay.
Now, coal is very dangerous. If it burns at a very low temperature, it creates coal gas because the heat of the coal burning evaporates the other hydrocarbons in the coal above it, and that becomes an explosive mixture. So the one thing you don't want to do is go anywhere, especially with passengers, if you have a fire in a coal bunker.
But they knew they had this fire, didn't they?
They knew they had the fire, and Ishmay ordered that 400 more tons of coal be put on top of the fire.
Okay. All right, so now we've got that, and we set out to sea.
Okay, we set out to sea, but you've got to understand that they had a plan, and this was the plan. The plan was that the other White Star ship, the Californian, was going to leave 2 days in advance, which it did, during a coal strike when the cost of coal was through the ceiling, and these ships burn immense amounts of coal. There's no way they crossed the Atlantic empty, and the Californian sailed in a rush, in a hurry, and it went straight to the ice field and sat there with its engines idling for 2 days, radioing its position. The plan was that as the Titanic was sinking, the Californian would come alongside and rescue everybody, and not one person would die. And the plan went horribly wrong.
Why?
Well, the first thing is the Californian radioed their position every hour on the hour, and the Titanic, being that it was going to be in New York City the next day, and it had the Vanderbilts and the Astors and other people on the ship were very wealthy, who were all radioing their positions, their time, and making plans. We're all using the telegraph operators' attention full time. So the messages from the Californian about their exact position never reached the bridge.
Okay. And why would that be important?
Well, because they were going to be positioned, the Titanic was going to steer itself towards the Californian, hit an iceberg, sink, and the Californian was going to rescue everybody.
Okay.
But you've got to realize they didn't have scrambled satellite phones, they didn't have cell phones, they didn't have computer encryption and computer decryption. They were broadcasting over an open frequency that everyone else could hear, so they didn't say, we're waiting here in the ice field for you to hit an iceberg so we can rescue everybody. They just said, this is our position, latitude and longitude. Now, it was arranged beforehand that when the Titanic needed to be rescued, they would launch red and blue flares. And the Californian was on notice to be sitting there with Captain Lord, with the captain of the Californian, waiting to receive the word that red and blue flares had been sighted.
So he was in on this.
Oh, definitely. The Californian sailed empty and sat there with its engines idling at full, the boilers operating at full pressure, ready to move on a moment's notice for 2 days, radioing its position to all the world, and especially the Titanic, every hour on the hour.
Okay.
Okay, now that night, Captain Smith and his 7 other top officers did not get in their pajamas. They all stayed fully dressed. Captain Smith did not go to his cabin. The others did, but he stayed behind the bridge. Was a little room with a couch, and Captain Smith lay down on the couch. On the Californian, the captain and his top crew did not change out their clothes to go to bed either. They all remained fully dressed, and the captain of the Californian was laying on a couch off the bridge also, waiting for the word of when this whole rescue operation would begin. The problem was that Titanic wasn't paying attention to where the Californian was, and in fact, the Californian was 20 miles away. Now, unknown to the Titanic and to the Californian, there was an illegal sealing barge in between the two ships. And they were harvesting seals illegally. I mean, who knew 1912 it was illegal to harvest seals? But I guess a way to do that was to take a huge barge out into the ice field, lower dories over the side, and send crews out to the icebergs and kill the seals on the icebergs, and then bring them back to the barge and take them in and sell the seal meat and the seal fur.
Okay.
So the ship that was illegally sailing was called the Samson. And they had a prearranged signal that they would notify all the dories to come back to the Samson immediately. That was it. Fire, white flags.
I think. I started to say I think we just lost you. We had a lot of static, and then you were silent, so I thought we had lost you.
No, we didn't lose me. I'm here. I don't know what's going on, Kevin. Maybe people don't want me to be talking about this. I have no idea.
Okay. Good enough.
So the Samson is sitting out there in the middle of a sealing operation. All the dories are away, and it's night, and it's a moonless night. It's clear, and all of a sudden the captain of the Samson notices that a huge cruise liner comes to a stop 10 miles away, and that was the Titanic. But he didn't know it was the Titanic. Then he looks over to the other side, and there's a cargo ship, the Californian, fully lit, also sitting 10 miles away. And he doesn't know that it's the Californian. He doesn't know that the Titanic is the Titanic, and he's thinking, wow, I'm illegally sealing. I've got to stop this. So he starts firing white flares so that all the dories come back to the Samson, so he can get all the boats and the men back on the Samson and get out of there as fast as possible so he doesn't get caught for illegal sealing.
Okay, so he's firing the white flares.
And the Captain Lord on Californian keeps asking his second in command, have you seen any flares? And his first mate, or whatever you call him, says, yes, I've seen flares. And Captain Lord says, what color are they? And all this came out at the inquiry, and the second in command said, white flares. Well, those aren't red and blue, but in fact, 20 miles away, the Titanic had hit an iceberg. Now, it's interesting how they hit the iceberg, because the thing is that all the captains testified that they all went at full speed through the ice field.
Okay.
At first, that sounds crazy. But they all testified that the minimum distance you could see an iceberg on a clear night was 6 miles, and often you could see an iceberg 10 miles ahead. Now, up in the crow's nest is this guy, Fred Fleet, and it's his job to spot the icebergs and warn the bridge. There was never any testimony from Fred Fleet as to what exactly he saw and what he did about it. He kept being asked at the inquiry the same question over and over again: when did you see the iceberg? And his answer was, I don't know. The reason why that's interesting is because the Titanic or the Olympic could turn fully away from anything within 1,000 yards. So if you could see an iceberg for 6 to 10 miles, why is it that as it came up to the iceberg, it suddenly turned to the left and reversed the engines? And it's the reversal of the engines that caught everyone's notice on the Olympic, because as they reversed the engines, there was a huge vibration that went through the ship, followed by the crash against the iceberg. So Fred Fleet was asked over and over again, when did you see the iceberg? I don't know. How far away was it? I don't know. When did you see it? I don't know. Well, how far away was it? I don't know. And strangely, the man lived, survived the sinking, and actually committed suicide in 1965 without ever explaining himself.
All right. We have a map up here that shows the positions of the ships. We see the California way up at the top of the map. We see, and we see the ice field. We see the Samson, which was the ship doing the illegal seal hunting. We see Mount Temple, and we haven't talked about Mount Temple. I don't know what is that about. We'll talk about that. Okay. And then we see the reported position of the Titanic, and then the actual position of the alleged Titanic. What's the deal with the reported position not being the actual position?
Well, it's very interesting, because when the Titanic, the renamed Olympic, hit the iceberg, broadside on the right side, on the starboard side, it actually popped plates all the way down the side of the ship.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, there was a 35-minute delay before they fired the first rockets. And in fact, the Titanic did fire 18 rockets. There were 9 red and 9 blue. They alternated them. First a red, then a blue, then a red, then a blue. But at 20 miles, the Californian couldn't see any, and the sealing ship, the Samson, the captain actually was at the inquiry, and he said he didn't know what the hell they were doing. He figured maybe it was a party. He didn't know.
Uh-huh.
So it's hard to say what they were doing or why they were doing it, but it was 35 minutes until they sent out the telegram saying that we've hit an iceberg, we're in distress. And it was 45 minutes before they started the pumps to pump out the water, but it was already too late.
So they waited 45 minutes before they started pumping water out.
Exactly, and they knew that if water got into the coal bunker number 10, there would be a huge explosion. And they had no way of knowing that it wouldn't.
All right, now, was an explosion reported in that coal bunker?
No, but it was almost as if, well, if they don't succeed with the iceberg plan, then we'll have a backup plan, which is a fire on the ship.
Okay.
But the reason why the ship broke in half, which that was a very well-made ship, might very well be that the water did reach coal bunker 10 as it was going down, and that blew it in half.
Uh-huh. Well, the rest of this story is that Ismay was in one of the first lifeboats off. He survived it. 1,517 people didn't, but Lloyd's of London paid the claim on the Titanic, and
well, Well, that's what's interesting. Is you see, up until 5 days before it sailed, the insurance on the Titanic was $10 million, and just before it sailed, around the same time that J.P. Morgan canceled his reservation and 50 of his friends, at that time, the White Star Line called up Lloyd's of London and said, you know, we want to raise the insurance to $12.5 million.
Why? What excuse did they give to Lloyd's?
Brand new ship, fully laden, valuable, whatever. But Lloyd's went along with it, and 5 days after the sinking, Lloyd's paid out $12.5 million.
Okay, and that took White Star off the hook with J.P. Morgan.
Exactly. You see, there's conjecture, but it's very good conjecture that the British Prime Minister would have been informed of this in advance.
Why?
And the reason why is because the White Star Line was in a very bad financial condition, and if they went bankrupt, all the White Star liners would end up being pulled over to New York, and they would be J.P. Morgan's ships.
Okay.
And the British Empire was well aware that World War I was about to break out. And here, the Lord of the Seas, the British Empire, would have no commercial shipping. Well, they would have some, but they would lose so many ships to the United States, to J.P. Morgan, that their ability to conduct World War I and defend themselves would be seriously in doubt. So that's why this particular Lord Mersey, M-E-R-S-E-Y, was selected to hold the inquiry hearing. They picked the worst hall in London to hold the hearing, where the acoustics were impossible. Even a person sitting in front of another person could barely hear them, even if the two were facing each other. Every time a telling question was asked, Lord Mersey would steer the questions back to some other ridiculous point, and the press never considered anything because they were only interested in one thing, which was how come J. Bruce Ishmay survived the sinking. Mm-hmm. It was just like...
So this is kind of like the Warren Commission.
Exactly.
Predetermined outcome.
But it's interesting that back in New York and in the United States, they were about to pass the Federal Reserve Act, and that would establish the Federal Reserve banking system, where there's 9 banks owned by the Rothschilds and 3 by the Rockefellers, and those are the 12 banks of the Federal Reserve System, and also that was the constitutional amendment that instituted income tax. And J.P. Morgan was in favor of it, and all of his rich friends were in favor of it. And the Vanderbilts and the Astors, who went down with the ship, were the major forces against it.
Well, that's very interesting that as you said that, all of the static came back.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to take a break, and we'll be back right after this.
My name is Leslie from Oregon, and you're listening to The Kevin Smith Show, also known as the world's hottest talk show host.
Welcome back to the Kevin Smith Show, and my guest this evening, Gordon Gianni Noto. We're taking a lawyer's look at the sinking of the Titanic, and particularly in question was this even the Titanic? And I think we pretty well provided evidence that it was not. Now, the rescue happens. The Carpathia is near. The Carpathia rescues, I think, something like 250. Does the California ever show up and do any rescue at all?
Well, it does. And what was interesting was the Titanic, relabeled as the Olympic, was 100 miles back, speeding as fast as it could to get there at the same time, but it never made it. Everything was over by the time it got there.
So we have the fake Titanic that has now crashed into an iceberg. We have the fake Olympic that is full speed ahead trying to get to it, but they're something like 100 miles back.
Right.
Okay, the California finally gets there. The Carpathia, which does not appear on this map, the Carpathia played a major role.
They heard the radio distress signal.
Okay.
And changed course.
Okay, so they were not part of the plot.
No, the Carpathia had nothing to do with it, except they happened to be in the neighborhood, because all the ships going between Southampton and New York took exactly the same course, and they frequently saw each other for most of the voyage.
All right, I got a question for you now. I mentioned the Titanic Trinity, and that is J. Bruce Ismay, Captain Edward J. Smith, and architect Thomas Andrews, Jr. Obviously, Captain Smith would have had to know about this plot to sink the ship. He would have had to have been in on it. Ismay would have had to have been the one that gave the orders to do it. But we have Thomas Andrews, Jr., who is the architect of the Titanic. This guy had to know he was not on the Titanic.
He had to know. He absolutely had to know. He either had to be in on it or he had to be, like, fuming. He knew he was had. But, see, if nobody died, then it was just an interesting episode in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
But if it weren't for the fact of the Californian being so far away and the ship sinking so fast, then nobody would have died. That was the plan. So all of a sudden, an insurance fraud that resolves a huge corporate problem, a national problem for Britain, is all of a sudden a gigantic murder conspiracy.
Wow. Solves an insurance problem. Solves a
Keeps all the ships in Britain.
Corporate problem, a national problem, and 1,500 people die. That sounds familiar.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Now, all right.
But listen to this. The crew that survived showed up in New York on the rescue ships. They were all ushered into a huge building on a pier and kept there until the White Star ship Cedric showed up, and they were all hurriedly forced on board the Cedric and brought back to Southampton and called to a giant meeting, and they all had to sign confidentiality agreements.
Huh.
Not one single member of the crew ever testified in the inquiry, only the officers.
All right. Now, have any of these confidentiality agreements survived that we know of?
No, but if you watch the videos that you can see on YouTube, you'll see that there are people who were recorded at the end of their lives that everybody knew what was going on with that, and nobody wanted to talk.
All right. Earlier, we're taking a look at this from a lawyer's eye view, and you said a lot of people think you have to have a body in order to be able to prove there's been a murder, but in fact, you don't. And I think everyone remembers, I cannot remember the guy's name, but you remember the case where he was charged with having murdered his pregnant wife. And for the longest time, they didn't have a body, but he was on trial and was charged with murder even before they found the body. And today he is on death row. He received the death penalty, and he's awaiting execution. All right. You don't have to have a body to prove there's been a murder.
But here we do have a body.
We do.
Somebody can, and I haven't even gotten into some of the things that can be found on the bottom.
Well, let's get into that, because we actually do have some evidence from what's down there, because Ballard turned video cameras on, and the video cameras caught what is down there. And what we have, what we're about to look at, is where the nameplate had been. It should say Titanic there, but it doesn't, and tell us why it doesn't.
Well, the new nameplates were hastily added to the ships.
Mm-hmm.
So, sitting on the bottom in 12,400 feet of water, over 100 years, the rivets rusted and gave way. So, in 1986, and this is the first time that this ever was formulated as a realization that there was a lie. Ballard went to the bottom in a combination Ballard-French expedition. I don't know what involvement was with the French government, but evidently they had some role in it. And he filmed the ship from his remote-viewed submarine and videotaped it. And there, right on the bow of the Titanic, on the bottom, a couple of the nameplate rivets have rusted away, and the plates have fallen to either side, and clearly engraved into the steel on the bow is an M and a P. That by itself is case closed.
So where it should say Titanic, we have MP, which of course Olympic would have in it.
Exactly.
And
that's what footage from 1986.
What comments have been made in the press about this?
None. Zero. Robin Gardner wrote 3 books on this subject, and they said, well, he's a plasterer in England, and even people who were interested in the story read his books. The first one was published in the mid-1990s. The famous one was published in 2009 that said The Ship That Never Sank, the Titanic, The Ship That Never Sank. That was published in, I guess it was early 2009. And you can buy these books on Amazon, I guess. But the thing is he got such awful reviews because they said these are the worst written books ever. So, plus he's a plasterer. What the hell does he know? Well, you can look at a lot of famous, successful people and see some of the jobs they had in their lives, and then you could identify them by that job and say, well, what could he possibly know?
Well, man, I've been a dishwasher.
Right.
I've been a cook. I worked in a convenience store. I've been a salesman. I've been a cop. I've been a photographer and videographer. And in my spare time, I got a doctor's degree. But the point is, it isn't what you do that has any,
or did, what you did.
Yeah, none of that has any bearing on whether you can think I mean, you know, I know people with PhDs who just can't think.
Exactly.
And, well, as you know, as an attorney, one of the things that's being tested when you take the LSAT, the entrance exam, is your ability to reason things out logically. And that's one of the big parts of that test.
And that's why I went to law school. I took that and scored in the high 90th percentiles.
Well, yeah, I took it too, and I qualified, and my daughter took it. She qualified. She went on to law school, and I went on to Bosnia, and I did international police. I should have gone to law school. But the point is, it does not matter what a person's profession is, what their job is. That has no bearing on whether they can think. And if the guy can think, and obviously he can, you know, it is what it is. He's come up with the evidence.
4. It's simple.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, this picture from the side of the ship down, this is down on the bottom of the ocean. It's supposed to be the Titanic. And
no one will ever be able to dive to that level in a scuba suit. It's only going to be in a very thick submarine.
Yeah. Yeah, but the deal is, what is MP doing in where the name Titanic should be if this story is not true?
Exactly. Now, you can count the portholes, you can look at, there's other differences between the ships. For instance, the A deck is enclosed more on one of the ships than the other. There's the porthole count on C deck, and the bridge of one of them is flat, the forward part of the bridge is flat, and on the other one it's rounded. So I got so confused by different descriptions. Even the historians can't tell, you know, just like I said, you have the picture of the Titanic leaving on its cruise. People go, well, look, it has 16 portholes, but that can't be the picture of the Titanic. It's got to be a picture of the Olympic. But it is the Titanic leaving on its maiden voyage.
Well, it's one version of the Titanic.
Yeah, so the thing is that, you know, somebody has to go down there to check into this. And meanwhile, people that are buying artifacts from the Titanic, beware, you're buying artifacts from the Olympic. Now, I only have, I guess, 15 minutes left. I'd really like to talk about what happened to the Titanic after the sinking.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, that is the question that I have up next. What happened to the fake Olympic, which was really the Titanic? What happened to it?
Exactly. It went on to be a very successful ship that made millions and millions of dollars for the White Star Line, and was finally sold in 1935 for 100,000 pounds and scrapped, and it took 2 years to scrap it. And first they stripped out at one shipyard all the innards of it, and then they took the empty hull to another shipyard and took that apart. And there's no report of anybody discovering, when they removed the nameplate, what was underneath it.
Maybe they didn't remove it. Maybe they just took that piece of steel all together
and set it up.
Yeah. Now, you can go on the internet and find some of its innards, as you called them, that are in very swanky hotels and restaurants. There's a very, very swank restaurant that has the windows of the Olympic. But according to according to your scenario here, that's really the Titanic.
When they stripped it in 1935, lots of people bought artifacts from the Olympic, which it turns out are really the Titanic. Now,
okay, we have to step away for a break. When we come back, we'll be on Final Approach, and we'll wrap up. Got a big question for the lawyer. We'll be back.
Crop circles that frequently appear in fields of wheat and other crops around the world are well known. However, rarely do they occur in rice paddies such as the one that appeared today in a rice field in western Japan. That's what we're going to investigate right now.
Okay, we're ready. Let's go.
Researchers think that crop circles are created by advanced beings, perhaps aliens, who are trying to communicate certain important things that mankind should be paying close attention to. The crop circle is coming into view now. Certainly, this must be something of great importance. As soon as we land, I'll have the data analysed and do a follow-up report as soon as possible.
All right, welcome back to the Kevin Smith Show. We're on final approach here. That means we only have a very short time left until we hit the brick wall at the end of the road. And Gordon, I want to ask you a question now. As an attorney, in the United States, back when we were still really conscious of a constitution, no arrest shall be made except on the issuance of a warrant. And this warrant could only be issued if there was an affidavit of probable cause.
Exactly.
Not suspicion. These days, well, we can put you in prison forever and not charge you and never bring you to trial if we suspect that you might be thinking of one day having a bad thought. But we used to have a constitution, and it had this Fourth Amendment. And the Fourth Amendment said you had to have probable cause to get a warrant. Now, let's say that this event happened, the sinking of the fake Titanic, or the sinking of the ship. And let's say that for some reason you had the evidence that you have right now The event has just happened. The principals are still around. ISME is still around. Do you have enough for probable cause to get an arrest warrant?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I would bring this to a grand jury, and if I didn't have them convinced, then I would just go out and shoot myself.
All right, so this rises above suspicion. This rises to probable cause.
Well, let me ask you this question, okay, Kevin? How did a ship... Now, remember, the Olympic had a bent keel. It listed to port. Practically all the plates on both sides were nearly popped. It had to have new framing put in, and that meant that some of the cabins were permanently closed because there was new steel going through them to support the plates where they should have been, but the structure of the ship was so bent that they couldn't put the plates back on the side of the ship, so they had to put new steel in that bridged the crumpled area.
Okay.
To hold the shape of the ship. Now, how did a ship that is that damaged continue in service through till 1935?
Oh, that's a good question.
Now, listen. This is what happened to the Olympic, which was, of course, the original perfect condition Titanic.
Yeah.
World War I. It was in service until September 1915. The British government chartered it as a troop and supply ship. It was outfitted with a couple of small guns up forward, I think 4-inch guns, and it was painted a dazzle camouflage, which looked like rays, like the wide triangular stripes of gray and black. And I'm not sure how that camouflaged it, because to me it doesn't look camouflaged at all. If I saw something with all these vertical lines on it going across the horizon, I would say, oh, there's the Olympic.
Yeah.
You know, but anyway, in 1916 to 1917, the Canadian government chartered it to bring troops to Europe for World War I.
Okay.
When the United States entered the war, we chartered it. The United States chartered it in 1917, and actually, although the Titanic never sank, as the Olympic, it actually sank 2 ships, and one of them was during World War I. It was the only merchant ship to ever sink a German submarine, a German U-boat. The U-boat was turning to try and launch a torpedo at the Olympic, which was, of course, really the Titanic, and they saw that the captain of the Olympic, which was really the Titanic, turned and aimed the ship at the German U-boat, and the U-boat immediately submerged, but it didn't get very far into the surface, and the Olympic rammed it broadsides and sank it. And that was on May 12, 1918. Then, in 1934, in fog off the coast of the United States, the Olympic rammed and sank the lightship Nantucket, which they've always been a ship anchored offshore from Nantucket Island that is used as a warning beacon for ships to turn to go to New York. So the ship that supposedly sank never sank, and instead it sank 2 other ships.
Well, it's an amazing story, and it's a fascinating story. And part of the fascination, I mean, we just naturally have a fascination with the Titanic, but part of the fascination that I have with this story is that all of this, lying, deceiving, high crime, extreme high crime, taking place in the upper levels of corporations, the upper levels of government, the upper levels of banking and insurance. It's not new. It's been going on for a very, very long time, and we've been believing their lies for a very, very long time.
Right. And, you know, there's so many conspiracy theories out there, and different people laugh at it and make fun of it. But, you know, here we have proof that something that's been in every history book since 1912 is a lie. It's shocking.
It is. It is.
When I first was reading it, I just about fell out of my chair. I was like, "Oh my God!" I was stunned. I stood up and I walked around in a daze, going, "Oh my God!" And I knew this was true.
Well, I think that the fact that you know, you've looked at the evidence, and we've presented visually evidence here tonight for those who have been watching, and I hope you've been watching. But anyway, you know, you've taken a look at this evidence as a lawyer, and the fact that you say that the visual evidence as well as sort of the documentary evidence, the history of the two ships and so forth, rises to the level of probable cause, and you would be able to get arrest warrants today. So let me ask you this very quickly, and we've only got about 30 seconds here before we have to start landing this for this evening.
Oh, dear.
So here we go. Here's the question. You have enough probable cause to get the warrants. Do you have enough that you think you could get a conviction?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. You just read the transcript of the hearing on the Titanic that was held, and you got to realize that the United States wanted to hold an inquiry, and the British government said, "Oh no, that was a British ship. It was at sea. We're going to hold the inquiry," and so nothing was asked in New York.
All right. If you will, stay on the line with us for just a moment, and I'll bring this in for a landing. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that this evening's anniversary show, anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic, I hope it's been enlightening. I hope you see that not everything you read in the history books is exactly as it is written. In fact, a great deal of our history has been monkeyed with. And here's some very, very compelling evidence. And we've asked Gordon Gianninotto to take a look at it as an attorney, because he is. And we've asked the tough question: could you get a warrant? Could you get a conviction? And he says, yes, I could. Absolutely. Let me remind you, as we close out this evening, we have coming up this weekend, this Saturday, we have something called the Alternative Universe Eye Conference. Now, the Alternative Universe Eye Conference is a totally brand new concept in bringing conferences to you. Get your ticket today, all right? My friends call me Steel Eye. My enemies do too. And you can call me whatever you'd like to call me. Just keep coming back again and again and again. Until next time, so long, everybody.